Welcome everyone to the first public event of our Environmental Humanities and Arts Lab devoted to the city and its others. I'm delighted that we're able to welcome you here due to the generosity of the Department of English, through which I was first able to invent this convergence of energies several years back. The department funds our core activities and has co-sponsored this afternoon's event alongside creative writing and the Committee on Environment, Geography, and Urbanization. Thanks to Nell Pack, who advises the lab, and to Emma Johnson and Evgenia Anastasakos, our undergraduate interns hailing from chemistry, environmental science, English, and history. Thanks also to Carlo Diaz for precious aesthetic and tech support. I'm also grateful to Allison Cobb for coming to campus, for being the first artist featured in this first public manifestation of our work. We run a book club that has been reading Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass on alternate Wednesdays this quarter, and the next meeting will take place on Wednesday, February 26th at 5 p.m. Emma and Evgenia will introduce Allison and plastic and autobiography in a few moments, and I will jumpstart discussion before opening it up to Emma, Evgenia, and all of you. Suffice it to say that Allison's magisterial study and lyric reflection on plastic, which took her research from Portland to the Marshall Islands to Hawaii and to Mossville near the Gulf Coast of Louisiana, represents precious proof to my mind of the value of the arts in generating new forms and methodologies of knowledge production surrounding the planetary emergencies that encircle and threaten to suffocate us. The Environmental Humanities and Arts Lab, the city and its others, is a transdisciplinary lab based in the English department and conceived as a partner of the Committee on Environment, Geography, and Urbanization, organized around the study of rural, urban, and ex-urban, suburban life in relation to what we call somewhat carelessly the environment, including the peripheral or sacrifice zones too rarely encompassed in critical reflection as part of the metropolis, yet which are, in many ways, its drivers. We aim to synthesize the strengths of faculty across the humanities and social sciences and sciences in new ways, to support innovative, critical, and creative research by students in the humanities and arts on topics that may range from conceptions of land, sky, and seascape to environmental justice. We will do so in part by animating our home in Chicago as a laboratory for critical thought. This year, we're expanding the initiative to new campus constituencies like you, by launching this series of public events. And the next, on Monday, March 3rd at 6 p.m. in this room, will feature eco-poet, permaculturist, visual artist Julie Ezel Patton, author at the heart of the latest issue of Chicago Review, Architext. Stay tuned for further goings-on, including our regular book club and writing workshops in the parks. If you'd like to get involved or be added to our mailing list, please tell us that, and we'll send around a sheet. We'll put a sheet near the food later on where you can put your email address down. So just one reflection on what it means to do this work from the perspective of the humanities and arts. This morning, in my rereading of The Origins of Totalitarianism with some close friends from around the world, I came upon this passage by Hannah Arendt. "Expansion is everything," said Cecil Rhodes, and fell into despair. For every night he saw overhead these stars, these vast worlds which we can never reach. I would annex the planets if I could. He had discovered the moving principle of the new, the imperialist era, says Arendt, And yet, in a flash of wisdom, Rhodes recognized at the same moment its inherent insanity and its contradiction to the human condition. Presaging the delusions of colonizing outer space that drive today's tech oligarchs, Rhodes's despair also portends the despair of leaders, elected and non-elected, driven to forge parallel universes reputedly better, at least for the 0.01%, than the one we all have the fortune and gift to inhabit. These men's faith in the moon, Mars, and robots enables them to exhaust and scorch all the resources of our precious planet. Cobb's Plastic and Autobiography confronts despair, her own and others, dialogically rather than attempting to blot it out. She borrows from Claudia Rankine, paraphrasing Cesar Vallejo, in positing that any kind of knowledge can be a prescription against despair. May we all follow her lead, that of a poet, documentarist, activist, in continuing to pursue the knowledge gleaned from attending to the ambiguous, nonlinear, polymeric, painful phenomena that our moment and the moments of our ghosts, inherited and future, dawn on us daily in the most dazzling forms. I'll now pass the mic to Emma and Evgenia. Thanks for coming out on this Valentine's Day.
Hello, everyone. So Allison Cobb is the author of 4 books, including Plastic and Autobiography, which is the winner of the Oregon Book Award and the Firecracker Award. She has also written Greenwood, After We All Died, and Born Too. Her work has appeared in journals including Best American Poetry, Denver Quarterly, and Colorado Review. Cobb has been a residential artist at Jurassic and Playa and received fellowships from the Oregon Arts Commission, the Regional Arts and Culture Council, and the New York Foundation for the Arts. She contributes to environmental and climate justice efforts at the Environmental Defense Fund, and she is a native of Los Alamos, New Mexico, and currently lives in Portland, Oregon.
On her website, Cobb calls writing a way that she charts her own survival when work in the environmental field grinds on her mind, body, and soul. Her writing does the important and necessary work of grappling with living in a dying world wrought with pollution. In Plastic and Autobiography, Cobb disentangles the ways her own life is connected to plastic, giving plastic back the life it lost after being homogenized through time in the industrial pipeline. Cobb spent 4 years researching the book. She writes that she wanted to find answers about how to exist now on a planet that seems to be dying, smothering beneath the outputs of human technology. Although she says she didn't find any, she did discover astonishment at the intricacy of that net, its infinitely intertwined connections wound across the earth. The autobiography of plastic is the autobiography of everything, she says. Cobb focuses on the lives of scientists and on the non-human, extending the meaning of the self and providing a common narrative for all life on Earth.
In a section called Desire, Cobb meditates on a plastic car part. She writes, "I want it to speak to me. I want it to tell me something about how to live now, on this planet, in this real life, as a member of the human species." She brings attention to this piece of lively death and deadly life, calling us to think deeply about the meaning of mass consumption and the culture surrounding discarded manufactured objects once imbued with life. Please join us in welcoming Allison Cobb to the University of Chicago.
Thank you. Thank you both. I probably can project, I think. So, hi, everyone. So nice to see you all. Thanks for coming. Happy Valentine's Day. I really am grateful to Jen for doing the labor of having this event happen and welcoming me here. It's such a beautiful gesture, and I'm so happy to be here to get to share with all of you. I'd love to hear from all of you as well, and to Carlo for making everything run so beautifully, and to Emma and Evgenia. for the introduction. That was a beautiful introduction. Thank you. I was entertained by it too, because I believe that all of you read an earlier published version of the book in a smaller form in your book club that was published in 2015. And so when I said in that I had been researching it for 4 years. Well, the actual book, which is here, came out in 2021, which means I had researched it for about 10 years. So it took me a little while longer. But I wanted to just, since it's Valentine's Day, it seemed appropriate to begin by talking a little bit about love, because I've been thinking a lot about love. The book that I'm working on now is about the fact that, as Emma mentioned, I grew up in Los Alamos in New Mexico, where the first atomic bombs were made. I was born and raised there, and so is my good friend Janine, who's right there, my childhood friend. And Robert Oppenheimer, who oversaw the creation of the first atomic bombs, famously chose Los Alamos because of his love for New Mexico. And as I was writing this book, I thought, well, this is going to be a chronicle of the ongoing damage of that love. And then I also thought about the fact that the people who live there, the many disparate people now who live in northern New Mexico, are drawn there and feel a deep connection and love for that land, from the indigenous Pueblo people who've been there since before recorded history, to the Spanish colonists who came and settled there 400 years ago, to the later nuclear colonists and scientific workers like my family. And so I thought maybe if it were possible to start from that place of love, there might be a way to find some transformation or some healing in those relationships. So I've been thinking a bunch about love, and I've been reading about love, and if you all have recommendations for me, please share. Reading people like James Baldwin and Bell Hooks, I started thinking about, well, maybe love is really something that we also need right now in our time. Thinking not about, individual romantic love, but about love as a social force that recognizes our entanglements with one another and our commitments to each other. And so that's sort of where I have found a space to dwell right now as I think about what's happening. And because that's so much in my mind, when I went and was looking back at the book to think about sharing it with you, I saw how much love is in this book. I really think it's the seed that flowers the grief and the joy that shows up here, and I see that much more clearly now as I look at it. So I'm going to read, there's a preface to this version of the book that kind of gives you the whole scope of it. So I'm going to read the preface of the book, and maybe when I'm reading, you can think about it, listening for love. But maybe I'll show you some pictures first. So this is one place I went in my travels that Jen mentioned. This is Camilo Point at the southern tip of Hawaii, which is a collection point, which just means the way the currents work, a bunch of plastic washes up there. So that's kind of what the beach looks like. And there's a picture of me, holding some, you get a little scale there, just kind of, the sand is just like full of plastic. And then as Jen mentioned, or maybe it was you, Emma, I can't remember, mentioned that a big part of this book is that I found this big plastic car part in my front yard. And I'll show you that. I didn't bring it with me, but that's my cute dog and the car part. It's about this big. I sometimes bring it, but I had to fly and it would have required its own suitcase. So, but you can get a sense of it there. And then, so what I did with this book, I did some research on this car part and found out that it came from a Honda Odyssey minivan, the first Honda Odyssey minivan ever built. It was made for the US market, and it was from the mid-90s. And because it was an Odyssey, I thought that was great for poetry and literature. So I made my family go on an Odyssey with me across the United States from Oregon to Lincoln, Alabama, which is where all the world's Honda Odysseys are made. And we tried to bring it back to them. And on the way, we went along the Gulf Coast of the U.S., where most of the country's petrochemical infrastructure is, and we spoke with communities who live in the shadow of those plants. So I thought I would show you some of those plants, just so you can get a sense of, this is a piece of Dow Chemical, which has the biggest petrochemical plant in the Western Hemisphere on the Gulf Coast. That's what it looks like during the day. And that is it at night. So I had not been to a deeply industrialized petrochemical community before. And so that was, I did a lot of learning there, and those landscapes are really, they're kind of hard to capture. They're like, sublime in that way, like going to the Grand Canyon, but opposite, I guess. So I will go ahead and read the preface of this book, and you all can think about love. And please feel casual, like get some snacks in the back, and we're in the tea room, we're having a reading club meeting. So it's all very regimented out there, I know, but I hope you'll feel relaxed. This has an epigraph from Rebecca Solnit that says, "I wanted to trace the lost patterns that came before the world was broken and find the new ones we could make out of the shards." Can you hear me in the back, Carlos? Okay. If you can't stop being able to hear me, will you just give me a sign? Okay, thank you. The thing turned up in a corner of the yard, just outside the fence. I found it when I went out to take Quincy for a walk. Curved and black, plastic, 4 feet long, a foot at its widest. I thought at first it was a car bumper. I put it in the grass by the porch. The next morning it was still there. I sat next to it in the sun and looked closely. It was not the first piece of plastic junk I had sat staring at. For nearly a year, I'd been picking up all the plastic I found on my daily dog walk. I'd been arranging it into patterns, taking photographs. I'd been storing it all up in plastic garbage bags on the back porch. I didn't know exactly why I was doing this. I wanted to understand something. Plastic on the dog walk, plastic on visits to the beach, plastic studding the ground everywhere I looked. I gathered it all up. I am the no and the yes. A line from the poet Hannah Sobelman's first book. It has lived with me for years, sometimes whispering through my mind in its old, remembered rhythm. In the poem, Sobelman follows the line with a qualifying phrase. She narrows it, makes it domestic. But I want the raw declaration hanging there on the turn of itself. I am the no and the yes. For nearly half my life, I have worked for an environmental group. I spend most of my days in front of a computer screen, taking in a deluge of information about planetary trauma and emergency. Most of it floods through me, too vast to grasp, but plastic was a shard that stuck. Plastic I could touch, and it could touch me back. On this day, as I sat beside the car part, I was thinking about the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, his essay called The Thing. His book, Poetry, Language, Thought, had sat on my shelf unopened for more than a decade since graduate school. A few days earlier, on a whim, I picked it up. Heidegger writes that distance disappears and all things come equally close because of technology. In 1949, when he wrote the essay, he meant airplanes, the radio, TV. These inventions bring everything before us in image and sound. Ancient Egyptian pyramids, a cat in Japan, glaciers shearing off into Arctic waters. Everything flattens out, a uniform distanceless, as he calls it. But this does not make anything happen. The only way to approach a thing, to bring it near, is by sidling up to it, by thinking around or through what appears obvious. He performs this kind of meditation on the thingness of a clay jug. So I thought of meditating on this car part. It had a smooth surface, shiny. One side was flecked with light splash marks from mud or paint. Here, I'll take you back to this is going to make it life hard for Carlo, I think, but in the recording. The carport formed a complicated shape, wide at one end and tapered at the other, with holes and slats and ridges all along its length. The widest end contained deep score marks, some scratched all the way through the plastic. It was stiff but still pliant. Without the car body to hold its curved shape, it folded in half like a wing at its narrowest point. The image that came to me was an albatross carcass bursting with plastic. This was the first shard that stuck, a snippet in a news story about a piece of plastic from World War II found inside a dead albatross chick 60 years later. It stayed in my mind for years, like the no and the yes. I dragged the car part inside the house. Nearly 10 years later, it sits beside me, near my desk. I learned this, that the world is not broken, or that it has always been shards, kaleidoscopically interwoven, not one world, many, threaded through one another, like fungus hyphae through soil. World's End. As Catherine Yusoff points out, in A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, some worlds have ended over and over, lives consumed and discarded by individuals woven into systems that give them life and death power. Like settler colonialism, like capitalism, these are systems built by humans, but they exceed individuals. They extend across generations and geographies, planet-scale forces of destruction. Plastic waste stems from this consume and dispose violence. I learned that waste is not an unintended consequence of a miracle new technology. Waste is inherent in plastic production as it accelerated after World War II. In 1945, days before the US military incinerated 2 cities with atomic bombs, a DuPont executive looked forward to the end of the war and the surge of buying that would follow as soldiers returned home and bought houses and cars, washing machines, and refrigerators. The job ahead, he told a group of marketing experts, see to it that Americans are never satisfied. Plastic embodies this infinite desire. Conjured out of gas and oil, the seemingly endless reservoirs of dead plants and animals underlying Earth, plastic transmutes death into eternal life. The word plastic refers not to any specific object, just the quality of a material, that it is capable of taking shape, an endless stream of shapes. Objects formed from plastic ease suffering and save lives. Artificial hearts, IV bags, the tubes snaking out of a respirator. Plastic makes cars safer, airplanes lighter, and delivers drinking water. The single largest use of plastic, though, is for containing other objects. 40% goes into packaging to be used once and then discarded, driving endless demand for more. Companies work to keep these facts hidden. When the evidence becomes too overwhelming, plastic clogging roadsides, oceans, living bodies, companies shift responsibility onto individuals through things like anti-littering campaigns and ensure that taxpayers and municipalities pay the tab for managing the waste. The lives harmed at every step, human and non-human, drop out of the equation. The same consume and dispose violence threads through me also. It has benefited me my whole life. I grew up the daughter of a nuclear physicist in Los Alamos, the town that built the atomic bombs, which ended some lives in order to save others perceived to have more value. We are woven into the same net, me and bombs and this car part. For a decade, I followed threads that tie us together through airplanes and sailors, the hydrogen bomb, Pacific Islands, the Nazis, and Heidegger. I followed threads through silence, loss, and grief, through the birth of chemistry and the invention of radar, through patriarchy, empire, and chattel slavery. I followed threads through apologies and their failure, through a pandemic and an uprising and living lungs struggling to breathe, through old wounds and new ones, hurt, reverberating, aching to be remembered. This object, a book and its journeys, this broken down car part, its life. This is my no. I have wanted this car part and its entanglements, often ugly ones and painful, to leave me. I have wanted not to have to face in my privilege the terms of its existence. I learned this. There is nowhere to go. The same terms that made this piece of plastic made me, my own body, and each of my breaths. This is also, it must be, my yes. Thanks. Thank you. So I'll give you the spoiler alert, because we know how this story ends. The Honda Odyssey plant, which bills itself as a zero waste plant, did not want to take back our car part that we had brought from Oregon. We shamelessly, although she volunteered, had our adorable 8-year-old daughter with her stuffy noon under one arm and the car part like draped around her, go in and like ask them to take back the car part. And the whole time my spouse was like surreptitiously had a GoPro down here, because you're not allowed to bring anything into the Honda Odyssey factory, and was like filming the interaction. So I'll just show you a film still from that. She's like, I love that so this is the Honda Odyssey representative. Everyone who works in Honda factories wears white, even on the factory floor. It's like an example of how like pristine the factory is. So that's the person who leads the tours. That's me, and then that's Noon. And Aster's got and I love she's looking back at my spouse like, what? These people are idiots. What? So she had a great idea that if they couldn't reuse it, since it was from the first ever Odyssey, they should display it, the car part, in the lobby because it's historic. And the person told her we don't have room for that. It's like this cavernous giant room. And Aster did this great like full body pan around the whole place and was like, you have a lot of room. She was like really persistent about it. And I had no idea that she was gonna do that. So it was really fun. So that shows up in the book too. I think that's it. Is that good?
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
So I'll get us started here in talking about this amazing book with Allison. We can like all chat, or you can also request that Allison read another section. I don't know how many of you, because this is our first extension into the public, I don't know how many of you had a chance to read the Essay Press first edition chapbook of Plastic and Autobiography. I'm going to ask Allison, my question will be pitched with the presumption of this like decade-long, incredibly labyrinthine artifact, which is the Nightboat Books edition, but you all have access because it's free. Yay, the internet and e-chapbooks to the shorter version. But okay, so I just want to start us off with a question which is kind of a cluster of questions, and it's sort of for my students. It boils down to why experimental writing, why poetry, why nonlinear prose, And there are a cluster of questions bound up in this because these are sort of questions that I pose myself all the time. There are a few things about this book that I think are amazing that have to do with the way it represents a representation which goes against the grain of the spectacle. So, you know, one is that this book has it has a couple of diagrams in it, but it does not have images in it. And it almost feels like it's withholding the image. It discusses a very famous National Geographic photo that maybe some of you are familiar with, of the sort of autopsied plastic of an albatross. And it feels as though there's so much attention to the photo that it feels like a gap, that the photo is not there to be given to people. Now, we all know that in the age of the internet, you can Google it and you can find it without too much trouble, but I don't think that's why you withheld it. I think there's something else going on here. So one of the questions is, why the poor medium of writing, which in its iconoclasm, when we tend to think that this is a culture that responds to nothing but the image, the spectacle, you know. Like you can't Instagram this easily, although I tried. You know, Carlo made a beautiful poster and the cover is great and such, but it's like non-Instagrammable. And the other thing about this that I think is extraordinary is the time that you put into it. So the decade or more even, but like roughly a decade of work going into this book, which ends up being 340 pages long, and the font is pretty small. So, it's not like, yeah, it's a very long work, and it takes a lot of time to read and absorb it. So it is very much not the time of the spectacle, and it's not the time of the news cycle. So I'm interested in that right now because I've been thinking a lot about the despair of a person who thinks in 10-year research chunks and how we just can't keep up with the assaults that are happening daily, hourly, minutely, you know, right now. On the environment and also otherwise. And then the other part of it is the non-linear aspect of the narrative, you know, and of course there's like one way of answering, which would be, well, why why writing? Because I'm a writer. Why non-linear narrative? Because I don't think in lines, but I'm interested if you could reflect on what you think the value is of these forms, of the iconoclasm, of the long-term, really like almost a durational kind of work, because it takes you almost as long to read as it would like a 19th century novel, which were written for like bourgeois, you know, ladies of leisure who had the time to sit there like and read a long novel by Henry James with page-long sentences in them. And
Jen, you're really selling this book as a read. It's got short sections, you all.
No, this is like also, this is the captive audience where there are actually people living and, you know, like operating on this campus who actually think that this kind of work is important and they're still making it. Like, what? It still exists. But so how do we sort of tell ourselves that this has a value when it seems like the spectacle and its brutality is consistently stupefying us into paralysis?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Just kidding. Well, so you said the thing about duration, like why, the long time spent writing, and then you talked about nonlinearity. I think so the thing about spending a long time writing is that, well, I just really, I live my books. I think that you do that too. Like the project is not separate from the life that I'm living. It's like I was living plastic while I was writing it. And so there was duration in the time that it took me to learn and experience the things that I needed to learn and experience to be able to write the book. And like one concrete piece of that was we visited communities in the Gulf Coast, and I wasn't going to go and like parachute into a community, as is so often happens with a scholar or a researcher, and be like, extract some information from them and then go away and use it for my purposes. My object was to form relationships with people who were willing to be in relation with me and then learn from the relationship. And so that is in and of itself a piece of duration, that's required. And actually one thing that came out of that is there's one community near that, the Smokestacks, that is a historically Black community formed out of segregation, and was in the process, when I got there, being completely wiped out by the port, which was expanding. It's gone now. That community is gone. But I worked with community members to do a series of oral histories with those community members, and that's going to be in the archive of the Black Diasporic Archive at the University of Texas at Austin. It's going to be up there any moment now. So, I mean, and that's a project that is extended until now. So I just see the book as one piece of a larger set of activities and activism and engagements that have to do with a life, and life has duration. So that's part of the duration. And then you asked about nonlinearity. I'm trained as a poet, and I feel like that's a wonderful gift, because I'm not writing as a scientist, I'm not writing as a historian, I'm not writing as an objective journalist. I'm writing creatively, and I'm writing in a way not against discipline, but like as a human. So I'm not working in a specialty. I'm working with figuring out how to be a human now on this planet, and that requires, like, for me, it requires looking into some history and figuring out some stuff about chemistry and, talking to people. And so part of the nonlinearity is also just the lived aspect of it. I set out, because plastic is such a big topic, right? Like plastic is so ubiquitous and takes so many guises, it kind of disappears. It can be hard to see. And so my thought, actually from the beginning, was like, I'm gonna look at this technology and trace it in however many threads I can, like through my own body, through my life. And so there's a whole bunch in the book about, I just happened to discover that when polyethylene, which is the most common plastic on the planet right now, it's in your water bottles, when it was first created, it was really essential to the design of the thermonuclear bomb. I just happened to find that. So I was like, well, that's about Los Alamos. So actually a big section of the beginning of the book is about that, nuclear bombs. And I had this idea, because I'm a poet, that like I would write in these short sections and none of them would be related to each other and none of them would be about plastic. And people would start reading the book and be like, what am I reading? What is this? And then like the threads would reveal themselves later in the book. You'd be like, oh, the connection is all plastic. And my publisher was like, that's lovely, Allison, but please write a preface to your book so that people have a little bit of a map for where they're going, which I did, of course, and it has been a gift to get to write that, because I get to read it in places like this and give people a sense of the project. But I did want there to be a sense with the nonlinearity that like of just how ubiquitous plastic is, and that you can be anyone and write about anything or think about anything, you're thinking about plastic. So, yeah.
And then just like the only bit that you didn't talk about that I often think about with my students, like showing them some of the images that you describe, like also the portrait of Ulam with the eyes, is like the images. Did you think about withholding images, or what do you think that writing has to offer against like such an image-centric culture?
I mean, that is so interesting that you asked that, because I have never really thought about it in that way. But I think for me, approaching all of the topics was sort of excavating as a writer. So rather than seeing the image and passing past it, which we are learned to do so well in the culture, like you get the image and you go, I really had to like dive into those images and think about how they were working and how they were working on me and what my relationship was to them, the relationship to the topic. And it was the same as like being in the communities on the Gulf Coast or being at the South Point of Hawaii, like, which also I didn't parachute into, you know, I formed relationships there. So it was this kind of excavating work that was, for me, because I am a writer, like part of the question, part of the answer is actually like, because I'm a writer, but it was part of that like excavating of words, which is what I'm drawn to do, was the same for the images. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like, you didn't just like take the photo of the Mona Lisa with your cell phone and then continue on for the next thing in the Louvre.
Mm-hmm. I might have done that. But
Okay, so my question was like really 3 questions in one. So let's open it up, and like Emma and Evgenia have already prepared questions too, if you want.
Evgenia's like, we did.
Okay. No, it can be really anyone. Yeah, and if there aren't yet, I have like plenty of questions up my sleeve. So, yeah.
Yeah, if you do want to ask a question, please just speak into the mic so that we can record it.
Yeah, thank you so much. Like one part in your sort of preprint version, it's titled Nothing, and you also talk about the I am, the no, and the yes. And just to like read a bit from it, it says, so this, the dead albatross chick on its back in the grass, a knife slides inside its white feathers, mercy floated towards me, towards the door, not there. The cut reveals a black cylinder of plastic, a bottle cap, a toy top. Plastic erupts from inside the chick. When I read this, I was almost like hit with the line of the cut reveals a black cylinder of plastic, because I was like, I had this expectation of like, oh, like cutting a living thing would reveal like blood or like things of that nature, but the fact that it was plastic was like very shocking to me. Mm-hmm. And like these ideas of like plastic having its own sort of life, and like it's like threaded throughout all of the your book. And I just wanted to hear more about, like, I'm kind of confused still about this yes and no idea. So could you explain more about that? Yeah.
So Emma is asking about, well, sort of, I mean, one thing you feel like you pointed out, Emma, was the repulsion, I think, maybe, of the experiences, some of the experiences with plastic I had or that I described. There's like a kind of violence in them, particularly the albatross chick who is, you know, necropsied, and you cut it open and out comes, instead of blood and guts, comes pieces of plastic. So part of what you're talking about, I think, is that repulsion experience, which I think, but then you keyed into the no and the yes, which I think is really what is at the heart of that there, and I think it has to do with love too, because love's like messy, not clean and beautiful always, right? And it was a real act of love that the photographer who took the photo of that albatross, who had come to know it, she's a field wildlife photographer, had come to know that bird, and then it was dead. It was love-fueled anger. Like, she wanted to know what had killed that bird, like every last piece of plastic, and there were like 500, right? And she took everyone out, and it was gross. It was a gross experience. She was in the tropical heat. She was on the island. having that experience. So I think the no and the yes is partly that repulsion. Like, I don't need to spend 10 years thinking about plastic, and why would I? Yuck. And I actually stopped writing the book for a while because I felt very depressed. And I was like, if I'm not enjoying this engagement, like, no one's going to want to read what I write. And so I had to step away from it for a little bit. But I think that the yes comes from what I was talking about the inescapability of our entanglements, right? Like, if I have this very natural love for the place that I live, for the planet. And I also love people. I came to love so many new people in writing this book. And I love the people that are being harmed by these technologies, like the people I came to know on the Gulf Coast. And so I think that's that's a little bit the tension, like, and I feel it, gosh, right now every day. Like, I would like to just look away, and I just got a new sauna at my house, go hang out in the sauna in Portland, Oregon. But the yes, the yes drives me to engage as I can. So hope that helps.
Thank you.
We can open it up to the whole room. As I say, yeah, if you have a question, just.
Thank you, Allison, for being here and for sharing with us your wonderful work.
Thank you.
I was reading the file that was made available to us. I was struck by your choice of talking about the atomic bomb, right, and about nuclear energy, and also because the atomic bomb is such an exceptional event, right?
Yeah.
There is something so different, so uncanny about it, right?
Right.
And it surprised me that you started through nuclear energy, like that it took it as a starting point to think about something like that is the most ubiquitous that I can think of, that is plastic, right? And I was, it just, this kind of juxtaposition stayed with me, like this contrast between, what ought not to be repeated, what should not be repeated, like the atomic bomb, and you quote Heidegger and the hydrogen bomb and all that, right? And what cannot be avoided, which is plastic, right? So I wanted to ask you more about your choice for bringing in the atomic bomb more specifically, right? To this reflection and like beyond the obvious autobiographical fact that you were born in Los Alamos. Can you tell us more about that choice?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. And that's so well phrased. I never heard that phrased in quite that way before, that the thing that should never be repeated and the thing that can't be avoided. So beautifully phrased. They're fused for me in the sense that they both, plastic and nuclear technologies, are both a result of the industrial expansion that came from World War II. Plastic existed before that, but it was not so heavily industrialized in so many different forms. That all happened for the war. Like, nylon was invented for the war effort. Nylon was invented by accident, but it was used in the war effort. And so, it's called the post-World War II era is called the Age of Acceleration, with these really speeding up of these technologies, and without a sort of regard for, without a long-term regard for impact. And in fact, nuclear waste is also the thing that cannot be avoided, right? It's in in the same way that plastic is in all of us now. For 50 years before that, nuclear waste has been in all of us and continues to be, because, of course, there weren't only 2 atomic bombs used. The U.S. bombed itself 900 times, testing atomic weapons, and countries around the world did the same. So I see them as being, and they also are both described by some philosophers as like hyper objects. They're things that have such global impact and a scale of scope far beyond human imagination that they exceed our ability, to really wrestle with them and contend with them. And so to me, they seemed very twinned in that way. And then, as you said, it was really just my way into trying to think about those things in really concrete ways. It was just really right through my own body. So that made a lot of sense because of my autobiography. Yeah.
Is there a question there? Do I see somebody's hand up there? No?
I'll ask a question.
Janine.
Hi, Allison.
Hi, Janine.
So I am curious about just your thought on, since you wrote the book, I know it's become more and more well-researched how plastic is coming into the human body.
Yeah.
And in your book, you mentioned that we eat like a credit card worth of plastic per day.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've just been hearing news stories like in the last couple of weeks about how the plastics are going into people's brains and their blood vessels and sort of like making our bodies different.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, even though this isn't related to your writing in this book, like what are your thoughts on this? Do you know anything more about this?
It was actually a scientist, or one of the scientists, who figured out that a lot of plastic migrates. It is lipophilic, which means it likes fatty deposits, and our brains have a lot of fat in them because fat is an energy store, I guess. So our brains need a lot of energy. They have a lot of fat. And so it was a scientist at University of New Mexico. Actually, I was on a panel with him at the lab in Los Alamos. Okay, here's a little story. The Los Alamos National Laboratory, the nuclear lab, they have like a sustainability committee, which is just like, I don't know, you can't make this stuff up. They're all very like wonderful, well-intentioned people working on sustainability at the nuclear weapons lab. And so they invited me to come and talk on a panel about plastic. But he was there. But I know, it's so weird. Los Alamos, like Janine can tell you, that town is super weird. There's many, many things that are weird about it. But one of the things that I wrote in the book that I feel like has become just so more and more true and almost kind of an obvious thing to say now is that, I have this moment where I'm sitting on the floor with the car part, kind of trying. I had many moments, like all writing projects, of like dismay and despair and like no way to control the chaos, no idea what I was doing. Writing this book. So I had a moment like that. I was sitting on the floor with the car part, and I was thinking about how we're so twinned, like the same chemicals in the car part are in my body. And so like we are the same, we're contiguous. We're not only entangled, like we're the same because we have these same chemicals. And I was thinking that's not, I don't know why, but it didn't at the time seem so widely known that, people come into the world with industrial chemicals already in their bloodstreams, which you can't be any more entangled than that. But I feel like because there's more awareness now about microplastics and like being in the brain and crossing the placental barrier and all that stuff, that I feel like maybe there's more awareness that we are like, I'm reading cheerful books about nuclear waste too. And one of the authors said, we are nuclear waste repositories, like we're plastic repositories too. So I don't know. There's a big no there. I sometimes just don't want to think about that.
I'm sorry, I was trying to leave, and then I was like, maybe there's something I should wait for. And I'm going to ramble a bit before I get to a question. But one of the things so plastic, or this kind of waste, being a very modern concept. And I'm also in the midst of sort of researching waste in sort of like pre-modern studies of religion, or like anything that can tell us about sort of like how to place this concept in, let's say, the study of religion, for example, for my own interest. And one of the things that you immediately come across is like maybe there was a concept of waste in pre-modern societies, particularly the tradition that I follow or study, Islam, where there wasn't a concept of a thing without use, that there's something that you don't have a purpose for, right? And yes, the nature of waste was very different and maybe biodegradable or like other substances. But this idea that something just stays and has still no use is a little bit confounding for the reality that we're living in. So one thing that I wanted to ask, and then two, the thing that I'm coming across or learning is that there's also two other kinds of, I guess, like, discarded experiences. One, or part of, I guess, the life of plastics or stuff that's not being used is that it's being exported abroad. And so the afterlife of plastic or things that are like that is getting caught up in what is sort of a new colonialism. So on these two things, I would be curious, and with the disclaimer that coming from the Div School, I had no expectation that this was going to be some creative writing related talk, and I was like here for hard science. But I'd be curious about sort of any meditations that you had during the writing this project about the idea of like living with things that are there but have no quote unquote purpose.
Yeah, as something that's kind of an anomaly, you're saying.
And like, how do we think about ourselves as human beings? As like, I mean, I can always meditate on this like spiritually and say, yeah, there's a very predominant sense of human experience in which people do feel like they have no purpose, or there's a sense of meaninglessness, or sort of like that sort of like sensibility exists amongst us as we reflect on our own sort of particular human experience. But there's also a very sort of physical experience of, the fact that we are living around so much stuff that has no purpose.
Yeah. Thanks for asking that and for your thoughts on it. I mean, so the thing about the U.S. exporting plastic out of the country and other, big over-industrialized countries doing that. So I made a decision to bound the book in the U.S. Just because I needed to bound it somewhere, and also I didn't have enough money to travel around the world and try to form the relationships that I would want to form to write about those. But if anybody's ever looked into it, it's really, really horrifying, and it's actually illegal. A bunch of countries passed a international treaty, essentially refusing to take imported plastic from the U.S. didn't sign, without prior written agreement. The U.S. refused to sign on to that treaty. So the U.S. should not be allowed to export plastic anywhere, but it happens all the time. And what happens is those boats get out on the high seas, and then it's like international law, and it's really hard to regulate. And they just go to the countries that will take plastic, it gets taken, and then the results are horrific because there isn't the infrastructure there to process that. I read about a village in Indonesia, I think it was in Indonesia, where there's a tofu making, traditional artisanal industry there. But the place has been deforested, and so people are burning plastic bricks to make tofu. That's so extremely, the extreme toxicity of that is just horrifying. But anyway, sorry, I went off on that a little bit. In terms of the things that sit around that can't be used, I mean, in the case of plastic, that is an artifact of capitalism and advertising, because the industry knew very early on that plastic essentially doesn't go away and lasts forever. And there's this famous marketing executive meeting in the 50s about marketing plastic, and the guy was like, the future of plastic is in the garbage can. And they really had these concerted advertising campaigns to convince people to throw plastic away, because people who were coming out of the Depression and World War II in the US had become accustomed to conserving and saving. And so there was really a push for people to understand is these are convenient, the convenience goods became a thing for the first time. You don't have to worry about it. It's cheap because of fossil fuel subsidies, right? You can just make more. It's still cheaper to make plastic than to recycle it. So to make virgin plastic, so just throw it out because you can get more. It's cheap. It's lightweight. Don't worry about it. So that is a creation. And I think you're right. Like, wow, if it has never been the moment, it's the moment now to really start asking, like looking upstream, right? To ask why we're in this situation and to maybe refuse to be in it.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Yeah. I'm interested in the fact that you're coming from the Div school and also that you wanted hard science, because Allison collaborated with a lot of hard scientists.
I spoke in terms of just like an academic sort of
yeah.
Like wordy, full of nouns kind of talk. And then you're trying to like deconstruct the concept. And
Science is hard.
Like
it's true.
Sort of meditation.
Right.
Yeah.
And a creative writing output.
In any case, I mean, Allison's done really and has a lot of really interesting dialogues with scientists in the book. But what I was going to ask you about is, are you implying that by being the kind of culture that produces so many meaningless objects that will never go away, that we are actually producing an existence with a certain level of meaninglessness to it?
The implication certainly there, whether that's the chain of sequence of like producing and sort of that being reflected back onto us, or that it's just a very dynamic, whether that was there, right before the industrial age, and then that gets sort of like manifested in the physical production, and that's sort of like, what we do, but certainly it's there.
It's very interesting. I mean, it makes me think of John Ruskin's critique of the division of labor and essentially of capitalism and the nature of Gothic and Stones of Venice, and the way in which the alienation of labor is also an alienation from the material world. Yeah. And it leads people to have meaningless jobs in which they're not, just making a pin, they're making the head of a pin, like deconstructing the division of labor as that had been marketed as a good thing. So in any case, it's interesting to think about that, and then to think about like how much meaningfulness you got out of this meaningless artifact that you did put it back onto the Odyssey, the Honda Odyssey, not the Homeric one. But it remains something that we don't really know what its, use really was, and it's been detached from all meaning structures. Other questions?
Thanks for a great talk. Oh, did I? Okay, I want to make sure I didn't steal the mic from someone else. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about the extent to which something like the piece of the Ford Odyssey. Wait, was it Ford? No, Honda. Sorry, clearly not a car guy. Is because we've become in many ways so good at not seeing plastic waste in our everyday lives. I walked here 30 minutes to get here. I didn't really notice any plastic. If I were to do the same walk in West Africa, I'd be walking over plastic the entire time, right, in any urban area, because it's not necessarily hidden. And in some ways, it's more accepted as a kind of detritus that can almost be associated with economic development. And here it's like if you see someone litter, for example, I'm like, send this person straight to jail. I don't even believe in the carceral state. But so I'd be just curious to know to what extent so much of the ways that we think about this waste could be also a reflection of how good we've gotten at removing the externalities. And so we don't feel like we're necessarily swimming in plastic, even though it's like coursing through our bloodstream right now.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's totally right. I had something to say, but I forgot. Oh, I was thinking, actually, I was doing these daily dog walks and picking up all the plastic I saw in my neighborhood in Portland, Oregon, but I actually couldn't do that in New York City where I used to live. I mean, I could, but it would be too much. to collect. So in a way, it was the cleanliness of the relative cleanliness of my place that enabled me to look at individual plastic trash. So I think that that's really true. Like being able to just do the meditation is part of the superior waste management systems that we have here, and also the fact that we're externalizing a bunch of it by sending it offshore. And it's also like plastic is, I mean, obviously it's not a monolith, right? But this isn't a book that says, well, it would probably never say anything so directly anyway, but it's not a book that says like plastic should be forever banned and never used, right? Because as the preface recognizes, plastic has functions that are important and critical. It's the insanity of using plastic for these single uses when it lasts forever. It's the insanity, more than that though, of the whole sort of orientation, as you were saying, of this just wasting with no regard. Yeah.
Question. Thank you. I really appreciate this, and I haven't had a chance to read it yet. And thank you for your question. But my question is about, along the lines of what Jen was asking about creativity or art or poetry as a strategy with, the recognition that using absurdity, using personal autobiography is perhaps trying to do something that, like the hard scientists or the people who are in positions of power to make policy around externalizing business costs, et cetera, you're not in that role, but you're in your role. Mm-hmm. And coming from the art side of things, sometimes we talk about what is the value of art? Or what is the value of poetry in the face of annihilation or something like that? Mm-hmm. And it's a different kind of value. It's not the value of a political, actor. Mm-hmm. But I think of it as, or it's been formulated by some as the value of making meaning from history in real time. Mm-hmm. So thinking with history in an important way mm-hmm. that is not reflected in our other disciplines mm-hmm. necessarily. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to get your thoughts, and Jen, you asked the question earlier, so I was thinking about how do you feel about the meaning or the role of art around subjects like this?
Yeah, that's a doozy. But Allison, you should answer first.
Wow. So I sit in two worlds because I'm a creative writer and I also work for a large environmental nonprofit and have worked there for more than 20 years. And I do feel like I live in two worlds because I live in the place where people are either formulating policies or defending them or, in that real advocacy space. And then I dwell in the world of an artist and creative writer. And what I have seen and what has deepened my conviction about the critical importance of the arts is that I see the bloodlessness sometimes of those technocratic solutions or those very legalistic solutions that have, with all good and noble intentions, failed to take into account even, and maybe most essentially, the emotional life of the person doing the work to change those policies or defend those rules. And I feel really strongly that without that close awareness of one intuition, I love Audre Lorde's Poetry is Not a Luxury essay because she talks about our feelings and our intuition as being the source of our most wild and radical ideas. That if we can't tap into that and be in that with ourselves and be in that with others, then we're not producing the truly radical and daring that we need. And I will tell you that I work at an institution that's an environmental nonprofit that nonetheless benefits from the status quo. They're a reformist institution, not a revolutionizing institution. Though we work around the edges to get them there. And so to me, it's just, it's the same thing as the siloing of disciplines, the like hard science versus the like I'm here at a creative talk. The person is not here to defend themselves, they just walked out, but and was like taken by surprise, right? Because expected like a very specific discipline. And I see that as an impoverishment of us as humans, but also an impoverishment of the kinds of ideas that we can have. And the arguments about like what can art do, what can creative writing do, like I just doesn't, there's no, I mean, obviously I'm a partisan, but there's no question to me. And the fact that that's a question to me, and like a persistent question, is a symptom of a deeper problem in a society that upholds like what the robots and the flying to Mars and all that stuff, like it upholds the, technocracy above all else.
Yeah, I mean, I have like a week-long answer to that. So, I mean, I feel like this is my whole life's work, is kind of to articulate that. The answer to that, I mean, I teach a course on writing and social change, and a lot of my teaching is like trying to live in the space where we think about how art and activism can collaborate, if not be the same thing, because no one's so delusional as to think that writing a poem is the same as putting your body in front of the bulldozer. That said, I would point to some of the things that were in my question from before, so sort of like the slowing down and the pacing otherwise of our intake of tragedy or sometimes good news. But like the way that poetry and literature, for instance, but all art can differently pace and measure experience so that our relation to what is happening is fundamentally different from the typical way, which is a kind of neo-colonial relationship to all objects, like, and all landscapes. So like, I capture that on my phone, it goes to the cloud, which is supported by a bunch of extractivist machines all over the planet, copper, lithium, whatever, and also is supported by the fossil fuel industry. And then I'm done. Right, and I sometimes talk about this, and it's in the first poem to my last book of poems, which is the fact that a good friend of mine, who's a very successful playwright and who I really admire, was listening to me talk about the cancer cluster in which I grew up, and my telling him that I just discovered that the copper that was milled across the street from my house was mined in the Peruvian Andes. And kind of like I was taking him through this whole thing that I had discovered, which is part of this like now already 8 years long book project. And his answer was, oh my God, this shouldn't be a book of poems. This should be an episode of NPR. And I felt really like crap for like a week, because I thought, I actually was thinking, I have ruined my life, I've taken up poetry, why did I not become a journalist? When I was a teenager and more pragmatic, I thought of becoming a journalist. Like, this should have been like a news magazine worthy piece in the New Yorker where it would have gotten way more readers. And I still go through that drama with myself. The thing is that I am absolutely convinced that now that people read those things and they might be enthralled, and then they turn the page, and then it's the next news cycle tragedy. And I don't think that that's what happens when you read a compelling work of literature or see a compelling work of art. I think it lives in you like the shard of plastic, that it kind of like cuts something into the Teflon that we wear daily to like shut out the tragedy that's everywhere, from like undomiciled folks to like roadkill to the headlines. And so I'm trying to create experiences and uphold the work of others who are creating experiences that just stick with people and that they can't shake, and like as Rilke said in Archaic Torso of Apollo, make you think you have to change your life.
I just quoted that poem to my class the other day. I think that's all true, and I also think it could be both, because I found out about the shard of plastic from a Harper's Magazine article that then became a book by someone else called Moby Duck.
Oh yeah.
But I think it could be both, right? Why couldn't it be both? I mean, it could be an NPR piece. It should be an NPR piece on every week, so that people can, and it should be your book.
I mean,
right?
Maybe like NPR should have more of a bandwidth for more difficult works of, thinking. It's just, I guess it's like the way that the literary ecology works. There's not much dialogue between, there's sort of like every time someone wants to talk about the environment, they're like quoting Mary Oliver, to the point where I'm like, okay, like go read some Lynn Haginian, and please don't quote Mary Oliver for the 10,000th time on Instagram. So yeah, there's sort of like this very easy ecology of like a certain type of writing that circulates and is a little bit more digestible than most of the work that I try to expose my students to, because they have the luxury of being here where they have time to think about difficult work and maybe to make it themselves too. We've got like 5 minutes, we have time for another question or two, if people have them. And, if not, we can certainly take it to like mingling around the hummus. So it's up to you all. Does anyone have anything they'd like to ask or say? Carlos, I don't know, like lots of friends in the audience here, Han.
I think like from this discussion, just one question emerges, like how do we move forward from these, but like how do we act or like move forward in thinking about these problems? Because I find that like we can discuss like have these great discussions, but a lot of times it's like when we step out, it's almost a little bit like separated. So yeah.
So Emma's asking, what the heck do we do now, in a much more articulate way than I said that. Like, what do we do about it when we walk out of this room and we go back to lives? I have 2 ways I've been thinking about this. I'd love to hear what other people have to say. There's a beautiful book by a person called David George Wallace. I think I have to look it up. I have a really bad memory. It's called The Songs of Trees. And he writes about 12 species around the world of trees, individual trees, not species. He goes and experiences individual trees. So he spends the duration of attention with these trees. And one is a ceibo tree in the Ecuadorian Amazon. And he's up in this tree. And he's like, there's so much life here. I'm in like a corner of this gigantic tree, and there's this massive ecosystem of its own, and this ecosystem is acting on itself. And so I think about living in an ecosystem where I have direct contact and influence to help shape that ecosystem. So that's what I can do right here around me, which maybe looks like one of the things that my family started doing after the last election was having a weekly potluck, which I am a writer, so I like to not talk to people and instead write. And so I resisted for years, but now I feel that's such a gift of it, because we take an action, or we read something and we're building these community ties where we're like remembering how to do movements, right? So that's like just one example. And then I think the other thing is often when this book came out and I would give readings and talks, people would be like, I feel so bad. Well, like Jen was trying to figure out how to recycle the cup, that you could not resist getting given even though you didn't want it. People say they feel bad, and I'm like, okay, but just look upstream, because actually the industry wants you to feel bad. Literally, there were campaigns like when I was a kid called Keep America Beautiful, where there was an actor who was supposed to be indigenous but who wasn't, who was an Italian American who was crying, the crying Indian who was like, keep America beautiful, like don't pollute. That was funded by Coca-Cola because they want you to feel bad that you have a plastic Coke bottle instead of making Coca-Cola feel bad and do something different. So I'm like, just look upstream. If I were going to pick a different career, I might work on campaign finance reform. So I guess those are my two things.
Well, create communities, and yeah, I will say that I'm so delighted that you all came out on Valentine's Day on a Friday afternoon when it's going to snow to talk with us, and it feels like a great launch to this endeavor as its own bit of community making. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Food.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Carlo. Thank you, Emma.
Yeah.